The morning my wife told me she was marrying another man, I was standing in our kitchen holding a bag of frozen peas against my chest, because the pain had come back in the night, and I hadn't wanted to wake her. She didn't ask why I had a bag of peas pressed to my sternum at 6 in the morning. She said, "Hartley and I are getting married in October. I'd appreciate it if you didn't make this difficult." Then she poured her coffee, the good Kona we kept for guests, and went back upstairs to take a call. That was it. 31 years, and the announcement landed somewhere between the grocery list and the dry cleaning. My name is Wendell Boyd. I'm 63 years old, and I spent most of my adult life believing that if I just got quieter, smaller, more accommodating, I could earn a peace that was never on the table to begin with. This is the story of how I finally walked away from a beautiful house that had stopped being a home, and what happened when the truth caught up to the people who thought they'd buried me. Let me back up. We lived in Highland Park, just north of Dallas, big colonial, on a corner lot, the kind of street where the lawns are edged like they're being graded. My wife, I'll call her my ex now, because that's what she is, was a partner at a boutique commercial real estate firm, sharp, polished, the sort of woman who could walk into a room and recalibrate everyone's posture. People loved her. I loved her too, for a long time, before I understood that being loved by her was a performance review that never closed. I made my money in HVAC. Not glamorous, I know. I started with one van and a phone that rang at all hours, and over 26 years I built it into a commercial contracting company with 40 trucks and service agreements with half the office parks in the Metroplex. I sold it 4 years ago. After taxes, the number was a little north of $6 million. I tell you that not to brag. I tell you because of what came later when people decided what I was worth. In our marriage, the rule was simple even if it was never spoken out loud. She set the standard, and I failed to meet it. The kitchen was remodeled twice in 3 years because the first quartz read cold and the second one read trendy. My recliner, a beat-up leather thing I'd had since before the kids, disappeared one weekend while I was at a job site. She told me it had gone to Goodwill, that it didn't fit the great room's language. I didn't even know rooms had a language. Apparently mine spoke the wrong one. We had 2 kids, my daughter Priya. Well, that's not her name, she's mine, and I'll just call her my daughter. She's 34, runs a veterinary practice up in Plano, and she figured her mother out a long time ago. And my son, he's 31, works in private equity in Atlanta, smart as a whip, and somewhere along the way he decided the version of events where I was the problem made the most sense. Cold, checked out, emotionally unavailable. Every word of it borrowed from his mother, just spoken in his voice. That's the part that takes the longest to heal, by the way, not the betrayal of a spouse. You half expect that. It's hearing your own child recite an indictment of you written by somebody else. The chest pain started in September. I ignored it the way men my age are trained to ignore things. Too busy. Probably indigestion. I'll mention it at my physical. Then one Tuesday I was carrying groceries in from the garage and the elephant sat down on my chest, the one everybody describes and you don't believe until it's you. I set the bags down on the counter very carefully, like they were eggs, and I drove myself to Presbyterian. My ex was at a closing. Couldn't be reached. I sat in the ER alone, gown open in the back, and a nurse named, well, a kind young man with a tattoo of a hummingbird on his forearm held my wrist and told me my heart rate was settling and I was going to be all right. It wasn't a heart attack, the cardiologist said. It was a warning. Unstable angina, he called it. Stress-driven. He used the word stress so many times I started counting on my fingers. He got to 11 before I gave up. She came by the hospital the next morning, between a showing and a lunch. She stood at the foot of the bed in a camel coat and asked if I'd remembered to move the cars before the street sweeper came. I said no. She sighed. That specific, surgical sigh I'd been hearing for 3 decades, the one that says, "Of course you didn't," and she left to deal with it. I lay there looking at the ceiling tiles. There were 48 of them. I counted those too, and somewhere around tile number 30 I understood something with a clarity I'd never had before. I could die in that house, and she would notice mainly because of the inconvenience. The funeral would be beautifully arranged. The flowers would read warm but not gauche, and I would have spent my one life making sure her rooms had the right language while my own went unspoken. That's the night I started planning. Not in anger. I want to be honest about that, because anger fades, and then you're just left holding a bad decision. This was colder than anger and steadier. The same way I used to plan a bid on a $500,000 job methodically, quietly, leaving nothing to a handshake. I gave myself 6 months. First I talked to a lawyer, a woman who'd handled the sale of my company, and who I trusted more than anyone in my life at that point. Texas is a community property state, which means the math is what it is, and I didn't fight it. I didn't want to fight it. I wanted out clean. What I did do, carefully and legally and with a lot of paperwork, was make sure my daughter was protected. I set up an irrevocable trust, $2 million, with her as the sole beneficiary and a corporate trustee, so no one could lean on her. Not because I was punishing my son, because I'd watched his mother teach him that money was the measure of a man, and I wasn't going to hand her more rope. I kept paying for everything as usual. Same dinners, same silences, same sighs. I learned to look at her across the table and feel almost nothing, which is its own strange kind of grief. You don't realize how much energy hope takes until you set it down. The divorce was final in March. We split the house. She bought me out, which suited me fine, because by then I couldn't stand the way the place echoed. I took an apartment near the medical district for a few months while I figured out the rest of it, and I started doing something I hadn't done in years. I went for walks, long ones, no destination. I'd get a coffee and sit on a bench and just watch the city do its thing, and I felt my shoulders come down from around my ears for the first time since I could remember. My son didn't call. My daughter called every day. Now here's where it gets interesting. About a month after the divorce was final, my ex got engaged. Fast. The kind of fast that tells you the runway had been built well before the old plane left the gate. The man's name, I'll call him her fiancé, because that's the cleanest way to say it, was a fellow named Hartley Vance, commercial developer, big personality, bigger watch. Drove a Range Rover and talked about his portfolio the way some men talk about their golf game. He'd come into town 2 years back, trailing a story about a fund he ran, mixed-use developments, 8-figure deals, investors lined up around the block. He took my ex to Cabo. He took her to Aspen. He took her to a charity gala where they got their picture in the society pages, and she sent that picture to our son, who forwarded it to me with 3 words. He's the real deal. I didn't respond. What was there to say? The wedding was set for October, a vineyard estate out in the hill country, the kind of place that cost $40,000 just to walk through the gate, 200 guests, a string quartet. My ex hired a wedding planner who'd done a sitting governor's daughter. And my son, my own boy, agreed to give a toast, to stand up in front of 200 people and welcome this man into our family. He told me about it on the phone, almost daring me to object. And then he said the thing I'll carry the rest of my life. He said, "Mom's finally with someone who's actually successful, Dad. Someone who built something real. Not like..." And he stopped himself, but the end of that sentence was already in the room. "Not like you. I had built 40 trucks out of one van. I had made payroll through 2 recessions. I had a heart that nearly quit on me from carrying a marriage that only ran in one direction, and my son thought I hadn't built anything real. I didn't argue. I'd learned by then that arguing with a borrowed opinion is like punching fog, but here's the thing I hadn't told anyone, and the thing that's going to matter in a minute. Back when I ran my company, I'd done HVAC work for a lot of commercial developers, office buildings, retail centers, mixed-use towers, and in that world, you hear things. You learn which builders pay their subs on time and which ones stretch you out to 90 days and then renegotiate. You learn whose buildings get permits and whose get red tagged. You learn the smell of a deal that's all front and no foundation. And about a year before any of this, one of my old project managers, a guy I'd trust with my life, had mentioned a name to me over a beer. He'd been brought in to consult on a development that fell apart, investors left holding nothing, and the man at the center of it had walked away clean and just changed cities. The name was Hartley Vance. I didn't say anything to my ex. Why would she have believed me? I was the resentful ex-husband. Anything I said would land as sour grapes, and rightfully so by appearances. So I did the one thing I knew how to do. I verified. I called my project manager. I called the forensic accountant. My daughter knew through her practice's malpractice carrier. If you can believe that's how the world connects. I pulled public records. And let me tell you, in this country, public records are a gift. Court filings, UCC liens, a federal civil suit out of Arizona, SEC complaints. It's all there if you know where to look, and I'd spent 26 years learning where to look. What I found made my stomach turn, and not for my own sake. Hartley Vance's fund was a shell on top of a shell. He was running what the eventual indictment would call a Ponzi structure, taking money from new investors to pay returns to old ones, skimming the difference into a lifestyle, the Aspen trips, the Range Rover, the 8-figure deals that existed mostly in pitch decks. There were 2 civil suits already filed. There was, I would learn, a sealed federal investigation already underway. And my ex, my image-conscious, standard-setting, never quite satisfied ex, had not only fallen for it, she'd co-signed on it. She'd put her own name on a loan against the Highland Park house to invest in his next project. She'd vouched for him to her firm's clients. She had wrapped her reputation around a man who was, in plain English, a thief. I want to be careful here, because this is where a lesser story would have me ride in on a horse. I didn't. I thought about it. God help me. I thought about it for a long couple of nights. I could have made one phone call. I could have torpedoed the whole thing. But I didn't, and I'll tell you why. Because I'd spent 31 years being the man who fixed things for people who didn't ask and didn't thank me. And I was done being responsible for a woman who'd never once been responsible for me. The truth was coming. It didn't need my push. It just needed daylight. So I gave the file. Everything organized, sourced with the case numbers and the names of the right people to call, to my daughter. And I told her, this is yours to do with as you see fit. I'm not going to that wedding. Whatever you decide it as your own person, not as my proxy. I flew to Portugal 3 weeks before the wedding. I'd visited once, years ago, on a job that took me to Lisbon to consult on a hotel retrofit, and the city had never left me, so I rented a flat in a neighborhood called Grassa, up on one of the hills where the old trams climb and complain, and I started at 63 to learn what it felt like to have nowhere I needed to be. I'd swim in the mornings. I'd buy bread from a man named, from a baker who started saving me the heel of the loaf because he'd noticed it's what I liked. I sat at cafe tables and butchered the language, and people were kind about it. My blood pressure came down 40 points. The chest pain disappeared and never came back. The wedding was on a Saturday. I knew the time. I'd be lying if I said I didn't think about it. I had my phone face down on the cafe table, and I drank my coffee and I waited. I didn't have to wait long. Here's what happened, pieced together from my daughter and, later, from about a dozen people who couldn't wait to tell me. My daughter went to the wedding. She'd decided, on her own, the way I'd asked, that 200 people were about to applaud a man who was going to ruin their family's savings, and she wasn't going to let it happen on a technicality of decorum. She didn't make a scene during the ceremony. She had more class than that. She waited until the reception, until the toasts. My son gave his, the one about a man who'd built something real. People clapped. My ex glowed. And then my daughter stood up, glass in hand, like she meant to toast too. The room turned to her, all warm and expectant, and she said one sentence, just one. She said, "Before anyone invests another dollar with the groom, you should all know there's a federal case number with his name on it, and I'm happy to read it out loud." That was it. That's the line. The room didn't erupt. That's not how it works with people like that. The room went silent in the specific way. A room goes silent when 200 well-dressed people simultaneously realize they've been laughing at the wrong man's joke. My ex's face. My daughter said this part quietly, like it still bothered her. My ex's face just came apart. All that careful architecture, the standard she'd held over everyone for so long, gone in a breath. Somebody, of course, had their phone out. Somebody always does. By the next morning, the clip had 3 million views with a caption, "I won't repeat." And the comment section had done the forensic work the guests should have done before they RSVP'd. By Monday, the sealed investigation wasn't sealed anymore. By Tuesday, her firm had accepted her resignation. 8 hours after the toast, my phone rang on the cafe table in Grasse. It was her. I almost didn't recognize the voice. There was no sigh in it. There was no standard in it. There was just a woman screaming that I'd done this, that I'd ruined her, that I was a vindictive, jealous, small man who couldn't stand to see her happy. I let her finish. I'd had 31 years of practice at letting her finish. And then I said the only true thing I had. I said, "I didn't do anything. I just stopped protecting you from the truth." And I hung up and I finished my coffee, and it was, I'm not ashamed to say, the best cup of coffee I've had in my life. Let me tell you how it all settled, because in this country the wheels turn slowly, but they do turn. Hartley Vance was indicted that winter on 14 counts: wire fraud, securities fraud, money laundering. He's serving 11 years in a federal facility now. The investors got back about 30 cents on the dollar, which is more than most people get and less than any of them deserved to lose. My ex wasn't criminally charged. She was a victim too, technically, though that word never sat right in my mouth. But she was named in 3 civil suits for the money she'd vouched for. She lost the Highland Park house to the bank. She declared bankruptcy in the spring. Her broker's license was suspended pending review. Last I heard, she's living in a rental in Lubbock near her sister, working at a real estate office, answering phones for an hourly wage. I don't say any of that with a smile. I want to be clear about that. I felt no thrill watching it. What I felt, mostly, was tired and a little sad for the person she might have been if being right hadn't mattered to her more than being kind. My son took the hardest fall, in a way. Not financially. He never invested, thank God. But his whole picture of the world had a hole punched through it. He'd stood up in front of 200 people and called a con man the real deal, and called his own father not real. He stopped calling anyone for a few months, went into a shell. Then in February, he flew to Lisbon, showed up at my door, was no warning, looking 10 years older than he had at the wedding. We sat on my little balcony with the trams clanking below, and we didn't say much for a while. And then he said the thing that I'd waited 31 years to hear, except it came out backward, which is how the truest things usually come. He said, "I spent my whole life thinking I had to take Mom's side to keep the peace. I never once asked if somebody needed to be on yours. We stayed out on that balcony until the lights came on across the river." He started seeing a counselor when he got home, learning, in his words, to tell the difference between a story I was told and a thing that's true. He met a woman last year, a pediatric nurse, kind in a way that doesn't perform itself. He called me before he proposed, asked if I'd help plan a small wedding in Portugal. I said yes before he finished the sentence. My daughter, the one who stood up with the glass, she's thriving. 2 new locations on the practice. She calls every Sunday. We talk about everything except her mother, which is its own kind of mercy. As for me, I'm still in Grasse. I swim every morning. I've taken up painting, badly and happily, and I actually sold 2 small canvases at a neighborhood market last month to a German couple who probably felt sorry for the old American. I take a Portuguese class twice a week, and I can finally argue about football and politics, not just order lunch. My portfolio sits comfortable and quiet, throwing off more than enough to cover a life that costs a fraction of what the old one did. I sleep 8 hours a night. The elephant never sat back down on my chest. People ask me sometimes if I'm happy. The question always feels too small for what I want to say. Happy is a mood. What I have is bigger and steadier than a mood. I'm at peace. Because at 63, I finally chose myself in a world that had spent 3 decades telling me that was the one thing I wasn't allowed to do. I'll leave you with the lesson I paid for the hard way, in case it spares you the tuition. I spent 30 years believing that sacrifice was the same thing as love. That if I just gave up enough of myself, made myself small enough, agreeable enough, the people I loved would finally see it and love me back the way I was loving them. It does not work like that. Love that requires you to disappear isn't love. It's a slow trade, and what you're trading away is your one life. And here's the other half of it, the part those wedding guests learned in real time. Verify before you build. It isn't cynical to check the foundation before you pour your life into something. A marriage, a partnership, a man with a big watch and a fund nobody can quite explain. It's wisdom. The public records don't lie. The patterns don't lie. The warning signs your own body sends you in the dark with a bag of frozen peas, those don't lie either. I almost waited too long to listen. Don't make my mistake. Don't spend another decade hoping a thing will change on its own. It won't. Sometimes the most faithful thing a man can do is walk away from what's killing him and trust that the truth, given a little daylight, knows how to take care of the rest. For a long time, I told myself that the quietest man in the room was the strongest one. I had that backward. Standing in that kitchen with a bag of frozen peas against my chest, I wasn't strong. I was just well-trained. 31 years of swallowing what I felt had taught me to call my own silence patience. And patience isn't the same thing as courage. It took my heart nearly stopping for me to learn the difference. Here's what I understand now that I didn't then. Nothing in this story happened by accident. My ex spent decades measuring people by what they cost and what they could buy. And so when a man with a big watch and a fund nobody could explain walked into her life, she didn't see the danger. Because she'd never built the instrument to see it. Hartley Vance didn't ruin her. He just gave her standards somewhere to finally point. And they pointed her straight off a cliff. My son called a con man real, and his own father not real, because that was the math he'd been handed as a boy. Cause and effect, all the way down. You reap what you plant, even when you planted it in someone else's child. If I could put one thing in your pocket, it would be 3 things really, and they hold each other up. The first is character, the plain decision to do right, even when nobody's clapping and nobody will ever know. I gave that file to my daughter and walked away because doing the honest thing didn't require me to be the one holding the knife. The second is good judgment, the kind that says verify before you build. I didn't trust my anger. I trusted public records, court filings, the patterns that don't lie. Feelings will tell you a comfortable story. The paperwork tells you the true one. And the third is grit. The bone-deep refusal to keep disappearing just because disappearing is familiar. It is harder to leave a beautiful house than to stay in it. I almost stayed. My daughter had all 3 the night she stood up with that glass. She did right, she did her homework first, and she found the nerve to say one sentence in front of 200 people. That's the whole recipe. My son is finding them now, later than he wanted, in a counselor's office in Atlanta. Learning to tell a story he was told from a thing that's true. It's never too late to start. I'm 63 and I sleep 8 hours a night. I swim in the morning and I paint badly in the afternoon. And I am, for the first time I can remember, completely myself. Don't wait for the elephant to sit on your chest. Build a life that doesn't require you to vanish. Check the ground before you pour yourself into it. And when something is quietly killing you, find the spine to walk. The truth, given a little daylight, knows how to handle the rest.